125 plus orders. All of them are implemented, none has stayed. Some challenges are there. A few orders have been challenged, but the courts are looking at them. So I think our guidelines have stood the test not only of the tribunal, but of the stakeholders at large, passengers, the facility users who are actually paying those tariffs once the authority has determined them. This was a challenge. That is getting the faith, earning that faith of the stakeholders. And we have achieved that to a large extent. And I hope that remains.
Let's give a big round of applause to Captain Kapil Chaudhary.
Thank you.
My name is Axel Heck, and having just been taken to an airport allows us a flying start into the rest of the program, for which we have prepared a scenario that we hope will illustrate the issues that you encounter when doing business transnationally, either here in India with business partners from abroad, or Indian companies or individuals doing business abroad. So our Mr. Singh, an entrepreneur from Delhi, contemplates investing abroad, ideally opening opportunities in the Indian market thereby as well. He approaches Mr. Lagerlöf in Sweden, who he knows is successful in Europe in the high-tech widget market. Mr. Lagerlöf, who has a manufacturing company in Sweden, Whichco, responds favorably to Mr. Singh's initiative, as this might offer an opportunity for Whichco to expand into new geographic markets in the Americas and, of course, India and the Far East in general. Mr. Singh's lawyer, Ms. Smart, recommends that Mr. Singh prepare a term sheet for his forthcoming meeting with Mr. Lagerlöf, and that it should include the following points. 1. Nature of the investment, either direct, seeking a say in the running of the business, or portfolio, seeking a return on the investment only. 2. Structure of a direct investment, taking a share in Whichco or creating a new company that Messrs. Singh and Lagerlöf jointly own and control, directly or indirectly through another company, Newco, or creating the proposed venture by contract only. 3. Where should Newco be incorporated? In Sweden or elsewhere in the EU, in India, in Switzerland, in Delaware? Should there be a private shareholders agreement, or would the public corporate documents required at the place of incorporation suffice? 4. In the shareholders agreement, should there be a put and or call option? And what about a reverse call option? Does the governing law need to be defined? And what are the practical alternatives? Should there be a dispute resolution clause? To arbitrate or not to arbitrate? Is that the question? 5. How would Newco and or Whichco do business in foreign markets, directly or indirectly, through local subsidiary, using local distributors, exclusive versus not exclusive, or using sales representatives? And what law should govern those contracts? And what about a dispute resolution clause? Finally, what about the cost for labor in terms of wages, social contributions, and taxes? After brief presentations of specific topics by each of my fellow panelists, we will discuss the issues presented in the scenario, offering observations on how to negotiate and later work with a foreign partner, and entertain questions from the audience. Our first speaker, sitting to my right, is Ms. Shahira Varia from Sri Lanka. And of course, she is very knowledgeable not only about her own jurisdiction, but also in doing business transnationally.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope I don't put you to sleep and not listen to the rest of the very learned panel. But I think in the paper, I'm not sure whether you all have received it, but in the paper that I presented for this conference, I have set out in detail key considerations for an M&A transaction in Sri Lanka. So I will only touch on the main issues today. Sri Lanka's proximity to India perhaps has been its springboard to development of its economy since the end of the civil war in 2009. And we now find India and China competing with each other for developing markets. India, however, has a much more historical relationship with Sri Lanka. And you will find that Indian entities like the Tata Group, the State Bank of India, LIC, Indian Oil Corporation, having a very well-established presence for many years. We also have a free trade agreement between India and Sri Lanka, which lists around 4,200 products for which zero duty is charged. The key considerations that I want to leave with you today is basically that 100% in foreign investment in Sri Lanka is permitted in many areas of business. The only condition that those investors are subject to is that the purchase consideration or the investment must be routed through what you call a securities investment account. This allows a free flow of exchange without any exchange control approval. And the Board of Investment in Sri Lanka, which incidentally is now promoting itself as Invest Sri Lanka, also has the power by law to exempt investors from exchange control, customs duty, and other laws. And the Inland Revenue Department is also given the permission by law to give tax exemptions. And though we are commonly known as a jurisdiction which has a great British influence, like India, I guess, because we were both colonies, we have now, since 2007, moved away a little bit, though English law is still the basis for contract law in Sri Lanka. We amended our Companies Act, which was a replica of the previous English Act, and we followed jurisdictions such as New Zealand and Canada to make operation of the law more simple. And a single shareholder and a single director concept is now quite common in Sri Lanka. We also have modern laws on intellectual property and arbitration. Incidentally, it was the Swedish a team of Swedish lawyers assisted us in drafting our current Arbitration Act. And we also have had teething problems, and we had problems with enforcement as well. And coming from the question that came in the earlier panel discussion, parties are permitted to agree to exclude the jurisdiction of the courts, which of course could be very dangerous, but the parties still have the choice. And the High Court is given jurisdiction to enforce arbitration awards on and they can only set aside awards on very limited grounds. And we are also signatory to the New York Convention, which permits the easy enforcement of arbitral awards. So there's often a misconception that Sri Lanka is a difficult country to invest in, but what I've tried to show you from my paper is that it is not in many areas of business. And if in a transaction such as this, which you see on the screen, the parties are free to agree on whether call options or put options or any other similar areas that are frequently seen in transactional documents. And they're free to choose on the governing law and dispute resolution mechanisms. And so therefore, India has a very investment-friendly, booming economy sitting at its feet. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Shania. Are there any questions already? Please feel free after each presentation, as well as, of course, at the end to ask your questions if you have any. Otherwise, we turn now to Carl Gustav de Geer from Stockholm, who will give us a presentation including on the magic things you can do with options, call options, and put options. And by the way, I forgot to mention and do it now, that every one of us has produced a paper which I think you can find on the website of INBA. I believe only Carl's paper, because he's smarter than the rest of us, got distributed physically today. Please, Carl, Floor is yours.
Thank you. My assistant is smarter, maybe, but what I wanted to mention initially was that when I heard that you have about 35 permissions necessary to make a foreign investment in India, whether that figure is right or wrong, if the proximity of the figure is okay, it's still not too bad per capita. The Scandinavian countries are about 25 million or so, and so you're 50 times more than all these countries together. I come from that region, and in those countries you need no permissions as a foreign investor. But as I said, it's not too bad because it's the per capita relation is okay. The fact that you don't need any permissions and that the regulatory environment is very light. There is no corruption at all, actually, I would say, in that part of the world, makes it easy for foreign investors. I have represented some Indian companies who are actually now negotiating, and that's something I've been doing here at the same time. A large transaction in investment in Scandinavia, and it's been quite challenging to participate in the negotiations because there are different negotiating styles from different cultures. But it's been very interesting. Leaving that aside, I distributed a small paper today with such a fine print, so you cannot read it when I talk. I don't like when people read when I talk, so you have to study it maybe as a night lecture to go to sleep, or I don't know. But it's about one aspect of joint ventures. My view is that 50-50 joint ventures, the only winners from those joint ventures are the lawyers. It becomes, as a rule, a nightmare. And a joint venture between different cultures and 50-50 is even more difficult. Mostly it ends up with disaster. The problem is also that, I'm sorry to say as a lawyer, that there is no good contract regulating a joint venture agreement. And some smart lawyers believe that they can regulate in advance what happens if the parties don't agree. My view is that they can't. And they cannot be sure that they regulate it in the right way, that they regulate to their own client's favor. There are a number of provisions, and I describe that in this paper, that you generally use when partners don't agree. I mean, there are three basic principles. Either you keep the joint venture and try to find some other body who will decide disagreements, etc. That's very difficult in practice because the parties don't want to let go of power. The other provision is that you try to force one party out, and there are different very eloquent wording and measures called Texas shootout or Dutch auction or whatever. I describe this in this paper. But you never know how that ends. And to write in one of those clauses as a lawyer, you better be sure that it works in your own client's favor when it's triggered. And that's a long way forward, and you don't know. And the third option is, of course, to terminate the joint venture. But there is also one other alternative, and that is strange for a lawyer to say, but that is not to regulate it at all. That's generally my advice. Let the parties decide. If they can't agree, let the parties decide what to do. And there are generally statutory provisions dissolving companies that don't do certain basic functions. I think I stop there in interest of time. And Axel, I think we will have someone else now because I'm more or less through with my part here. We will come back to some issues when we have the discussion.
Well, thank you, Carl. I understand it's your turn now to thank the lady for her.
We would not like to hold Captain Kapil Chaudhary for long, but we would like to thank her for her time and being a part of INBA. Let's put a round of applause for her. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Well, we now turn to the Swiss side of things. My two following colleagues are both from Lausanne, the French part of Switzerland. They're both professors. Bettina herself is actually the current dean also of the Lausanne Law School. And Edgar, who will be next to speak now, is a partner in an old law firm, also specializing in sports law, which is very important in Lausanne. As you may know, the International Olympic Committee sits in Lausanne. The International Sports Arbitration Court sits in Lausanne. And FIFA, the World Soccer Organization, sits not in Lausanne, but not far elsewhere, also in Switzerland. So that's a big issue there. Edgar, may I ask you to kindly...
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to thank INBA very much for the very warm welcome we have received here. And indeed, I'm going to address a few corporate issues from a Swiss perspective. I'm not going to discuss sports issues, but I'm happy to take questions about that after at the break. The point I want to focus on in the next few minutes is how to structure a joint venture and to give some ideas for discussion, for further discussion. So there are basically, from a Swiss perspective, two different ways to structure a joint venture. It can be contractual in nature. You can create a company that is held by the joint venture partners. And when you decide on whether to give a corporate joint venture or to choose the contractual joint venture, you may want to think about what can happen next when the partners don't agree anymore with each other. But you also want to take into account different factors. First of all, how flexible do you want the structure? And it is true that a contractual joint venture is usually more flexible than a corporate joint venture. Then you may want to think, do I want a permanent business or do I want to run a temporary business? And if your business has more permanence, you may want to choose the corporate joint venture. But in the end, I think that the factor